Hello and welcome all. Thank you for joining us for this evening's SFU Libraries Dean's Lecture on Information and Society. I want to open by acknowledging that I'm joining you this evening from SFU's Burnaby campus on the unceded, traditional, and rightful territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam First Nations. It's a privilege to live and work on such beautiful and abundant land. And for settlers, this privilege comes with the responsibility to address and repair relations between ourselves and the Indigenous peoples whose lands we occupy. These relationships are at the personal, institutional, and governmental levels. My name is Gwen Bird, and I'm Dean of Libraries at Simon Fraser University. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you this evening to our conversation between Robyn Maynard and Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. This annual lecture provides a venue for conversations about the role of information in contemporary society. We use it to address topics that will help us build a more peaceful, just, and equitable world for all. The series is generously funded by the Thakore Learning and Events Endowment. I'd like to thank the Thakore family for making this evening possible, and it's wonderful to have many members of the Thakore family with us here tonight. I'd also like to thank our event partner, SFU Public Square. The event is part of Public Square's 2021 Community Summit Towards Equity. We have over 260 people on the webinar this evening. Wonderful to have such a good turnout. I have a few brief matters of housekeeping to share before introducing our speakers. Live closed captioning is available for tonight's event. To access closed captioning, look for the option labeled CC in Zoom. We welcome you to continue using chat during tonight's event. Feel free to introduce yourself and share where you're from. In order to give our speakers ample time to take their conversation where they want it to go, we won't be having a Q&A as part of tonight's event. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce our wonderful speakers. Robyn Maynard is a Black feminist author and activist scholar based in Toronto. Her 2017 book, Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present, is a national bestseller. Her wide-ranging writing and scholarship on policing, abolition, and Black liberation has received numerous prominent nominations and awards, has been translated into multiple languages, and is taught widely across universities in Canada, the US, and Europe. Leanne Betasamosake Simpson is a Michi-Sagi Nishnabeg scholar, writer, musician, and member of Alderville First Nation. She has lectured and taught at universities across Canada and the US, and is the author of 7 books, including her most recent, A Short History of the Blockade, and last year's novel, Newcoming, A Cure for White Ladies. Her powerful work breaks open the intersections between politics, story, and song. Robyn and Leanne are currently collaborating on a new book called Rehearsals for Living. We're delighted to have them here this evening for this conversation and readings from this forthcoming book. Without further ado, please welcome Robyn and Leanne.
Dear Leanne, I've been meaning to write you for a long time, and yet it's hard to know where to begin. So I guess I'll start where I'm at. I can't stop doom scrolling the multiple crises of our time. At this moment, I'm preoccupied and filled with dread by the reports of rising temperatures, of just about last chances being regularly leveled by climate scientists, the continually shelved fact of the matter that things must be drastically and immediately shifted if we are to avoid untold suffering. I'm preoccupied with what goes unwritten in so many reports, but that I know in my bones. Some communities' untold suffering will vastly exceed that experienced by others. Some communities have been facing untold suffering for multiple generations. I don't want to live in this preoccupation, in this dread that sometimes comes to visit me and threatens to immobilize. So I suppose this is me reaching out simply for a leveling of the grounds beneath my feet, for communion, to help transform the source of this dread into a place from which we can instead plot, conspire, dream, and attend to life otherwise. To attend to the celebration, the preservation of life, without eschewing our own community's intimate proximity to death and loss. Talking and thinking with you has always helped me focus on the vitality, on the livingness of the traditions that our work emerges from, regardless of what the last several centuries of European atrocities have wreaked on our people. Our conversations feel, dare I say, therapeutic at times, but I don't see you as much as I would like, and the phone is not my medium. So I've decided to write you this letter. I'm writing you a letter even though it feels cringy because I'm shy. I'm writing you a letter even though I may never send it, even though you may never write me back. I'm writing you a letter at the end of this world. From Cyclone Ida in Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe to Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, the devastating forest fires displacing Indigenous communities from the Amazon rainforest through to Ojibwe Nation in Northwest Ontario, our respective communities, that is Black and Indigenous communities, are collectively positioned on the very forefront of the unfolding catastrophe. The crisis has already arrived. It would require a deliberate obfuscation to view the racially uneven distribution of harms that the climate collapse engenders as accidental. Even if we didn't take into account the dramatic shifts that are occurring and will further occur with the melting of Arctic ice caps, rising seawaters and eroded shorelines, desertification and species extinction that are now nearly, if not totally inevitable, the reality is that not only are an array of world endings before us, they have already arrived. Our respective communities have borne already multiple apocalypses that were inflicted upon us, if unidentifyingly, from the barbarity time of genocide, slavery, or colonialism. All of this making up the catastrophe that is iterated by Badur Alagra in the forthcoming interminable catastrophe, a political category and concept rather than an event, an expression of durability of plantation modes of social relations. The apocalypse is imagined, after all, in most classic European Euro-Western settler tropes in terms of the lack of clean drinking water, the destruction of the places that they live, the poisoning of the earth, the inhumane and restrictive responses to people left hungry, displaced in desperation. This is a condition that is already deeply familiar to our kin across Turtle Island and globally. You wrote about this in Dancing on a Turtle's Backs. By 1822, when many Anishinaabe in the North and West were still living as they always had, we were facing the complete political, cultural, and social collapse of everything we had ever known. My ancestors resisted and survived what must have seemed like an apocalyptic reality of occupation and subjugation in a context where they had few choices. To remix Public Enemy, Armageddon been in effect. It is the apocalypses of settler slavery and settler colonialism that bind our collective pasts and presents together in the calamity at hand. Today, the racially uneven environmental catastrophes of the present are inextricably connected to the unfinished catastrophes of 1492, the two genocides at the heart of the Americas, to paraphrase M. Vesey Phillip, when a death-making commitment to extraction and dispossession took hold on a global scale. This created a logic and political economy in which our ancestors became, through distinct but interrelated processes, what Cedric J. Robinson once described as a collection of things of convenience for use and or eradication. The factory of post-apocalyptic life that has unfolded its dramas over the last half millennia means that our collective histories are mapped out too, onto the racially and geographically differentiated vulnerabilities amidst the present future disaster. As we are confronted with the crisis of the Earth's viability, then amidst so many crises, I'm writing you to think together about what it means for us to work toward building livable lives together in the wreckage. As I write to you from the end of this world, I'm also very aware of both of our respective, if unidentical, subject positions as domestic enemies inside the settler state, and of our presence within one of the main arteries of Western Empire. I'm writing you from the belly of the beast. Despite its ongoing pretensions of being a benevolent nation state, Canada plays an important role in the massive carbon unloading and the ecological and human devastation wrought by extractive industries. These industries produce over 50% of the world's carbon emissions, not to mention the cataclysmic environmental devastation of the tar sands pipelines that run through more than 350 Indigenous nations in so-called Canada alone. Much of the unmaking of Black and Indigenous lives and the ecosystems that have historically sustained our lives, spanning Turtle Island, the Caribbean, Africa, and South and Central America, can be traced right back to here. In fact, while I'm haunted by the specter of the pending crisis, there's something about our sheer physical proximity to the authors of these monstrosities that's weighing heavily on me these days. Out of a mix of curiosity and compulsion, I created a Google Maps itinerary to figure out how long it would take me to travel from my house to some of the places where our collective apocalypses are being mapped out. A kind of walking tour that maps out some of the contemporary architects of the warfare against human and non-human life. As it turns out, it would take 1 hour and 12 minutes to walk, 28 minutes on the TTC, from my home to the main office of James Bay Resources Limited. While this is not a household name, James Bay is a Canadian-based company that is based in the Niger Delta region that is the homelands of the Ogoni peoples. In the Delta and across the region, gas flares resulting from oil extraction have been burning off CO2 emissions that are comparable to the annual output of Sweden. It is a site of both racial and ecological destruction, mutated food crops, toxic drinking water, rainwater that melts through the tin roofs of people's homes, and a wide assortment of permanent human and non-human health crises. Of course, even as this site of transnational anti-Black violence produces flares that are visible from space, there is no discernible trace of this available at company headquarters. That would be uncivilized. Enabling Google Street View, it is clear that little evidence links the decisions made in this metropolitan office to the crimes enacted over there. A medium high-rise gray building flanked by 2 Starbucks cafes and underground parking. Anyways, leaving this office on foot, it would take me 8 minutes to walk to the headquarters of Barrick Gold, another Toronto-based company. The headquarters lack grandeur, at least from the outside. The building face is a sprawling high-rise with green-tinted glass windows, but they are a big deal for the Canadian economy. In 2018, they made a profit of $7.24 billion and were prepared to pay their new CEO $18 million in 2019. They are also a big deal in the harbingers of premature death, the thieving of Black lives globally, marked as surplus lives, destroyed, displaced, and slowly poisoned by toxic leakage in order to pay the bonuses of those employees who meet their yearly targets. While in the headlines less than in the past, Barrick Gold, of course, is the majority owner of Acacia Mine, a site marked by a wide array of environmental and human atrocities against the local Tanzanian population, largely of the indigenous Korea community, where human rights organizations have attested to an array of sexual and physical abuses by company-run security, as well as a body count that continues to rise, reaching, according to state officials, several hundred extrajudicial murders since the late 1990s. The heavy metals and toxins are seeping into the river, soil, and nearby air, wrought upon the 70,000 people who live nearby. Yet the transnational links between this Toronto office and the world endings, the unceasing onslaught of Black dispossession everywhere, eschew my field of vision. 9 minutes after leaving this office front, where I would see nothing and feel everything, I would arrive at the headquarters of Belo Sun Mining Corporation. Here, my street view seems to glitch, only showing me the front of a seemingly closed dollar store called Rainbow Jade, inside of what appears to be a mini mall. But honestly, this does not matter. I just know that I am likely not missing much, even as this company is set to build Brazil's largest open-faced gold mine, the Volta Grande gold mine, in the heart of the still burning Amazon rainforest. You can see these fires too from NASA cameras in space. This mine, this future abomination that is orchestrated from somewhere probably close to Rainbow Jade, will leach toxins into the lands and waters of the indigenous Jaruna and Araya peoples who have strongly opposed the mine and are undertaking significant labors to fight for the ongoing survival of their peoples. But bad news for indigenous people is good news for colonizers everywhere. A CBC News tweet following the election of white supremacist President Jair Bolsonaro, declared that critics have lambasted the former paratrooper for his homophobic, racist, and misogynist statements, but his government could open new investment opportunities for Canadian investors. Colonizer meet colonizer. It does not take great imagination to say that if I can't virtually see this building, it is probably either gray or brownish or whitish, probably tall, and it probably wouldn't take much time to take it in. And only 1 minute after leaving this building, whatever it really looks like, even as I've crossed a hemisphere in terms of impact, I will find myself at the last stop, the headquarters of Copper One, yet another high-rise. Currently undertaking a legal battle against the Algonquins of Barrier Lake to mine the resources on their traditional hunting grounds, Copper One is not yet dissuaded, despite years of community resistance in the form of blockades and legal challenges. Anyways, you might note that this tour starts and ends somewhat arbitrarily. It could go on all day, with more than 1,000 mining companies based in Canada, with more than 50% of the world's mining companies traded through the Toronto Stock Exchange, to be precise. This tour of invisible carnage shows us that Toronto really is the global hub that it is so widely celebrated to be. It is on and around Bay Street that we find the direct lines between capitalist accumulation and those racial subjects whose land and labors are being accumulated and poisoned. It shows us that the climate crisis is not coming. For some, its arrival began long ago. All of this in 90 minutes, likely less because I'm a fast walker. I'm drawn to this walk that links Toronto and the settler nation state to the global flows of capital that emerge from an accumulation of racial and ecological assaults, largely but not exclusively on Black and Indigenous lives, both here and a multitude of elsewheres. Maybe we will walk this route together sometime. I think I would like to, but I'm not sure why I keep refreshing the browser expecting for something more to reveal itself to me, as I look for some trace or hint of the barbarism behind the veneer. Of course, this is fruitless. Toronto, like the Canadian society it encapsulates, has explicitly evolved to keep the violence on which it relies firmly out of view, a perfectly modern society that tidily keeps its atrocities out of plain sight. This absent and absented violence is what it is to look upon the house of the modern barbarian, walking in amongst their streets while, to use the words of Aimé Césaire, the house of the barbarian is at hand, the hour of the barbarian is at hand. Even if I were to enter these unremarkable buildings, they would probably just be filled with the dead-eyed graduates of schools like the U of T Peter Monk School of Global Affairs, named after Barrick Gold's former CEO, Peter Monk, who likely spend their lunch breaks stalking their ex-girlfriend's Facebook accounts, posting on 4chan and sending unsolicited dick pics, the modern technocrats of empire. I know that I will make this pilgrimage on my own at some point, possibly before I send you this letter. I also know that I will be disappointed and then irritated at myself for being disappointed, and then devastated at the state of the world that white supremacy built. I suppose that some part of my frustration and why I continue to return to these locations looking for something, fucking anything, is that it's hard to believe that this is what is to show for the accumulated catastrophes of our past presence, our ancestors' lives and bodies and dreams of otherwise being funneled, accumulated toward these undifferentiated gray masses of rock, brick, steel, and glass, filled with undifferentiated living, just barely, pink-gray masses of human-shaped greed. It is difficult to let it set in that it is for this that so many of us are dead and dying. That should we make it through this, our great-great-grandkids will have to look at pictures of this unremarkable landscape, these boring and unimaginative tributes to stolen wealth and stolen lives to make sense of the who, why, and where of it all. I'm acutely aware that it's our collective destruction as Black peoples, as Indigenous people, along with the rest of the global wretched of the earth that is being drawn up in these boardrooms of global finance, and theirs and their grandchildren too, though they are too arrogant to see this. The IPCC report brings to light what is to come. Previously unknown levels of fires, floods, droughts, famines, and shortages of all kinds, a planetary crisis on multiple frequencies, the state and corporate ruling classes working together to commit and recommit the planet anew to death or near death. And even as the final assault on the viability of the earth is being authored on the many base streets of the global north, this is being called the Anthropocene, a crisis caused by human activity that puts human life at risk. This is an affront, because it's not humans, is it? As Black political theorists Sylvia Wynter, Badur, and Badur Alagra remind us, human has never been a politically neutral category. In this anthropocentric framing of the climate crisis, it is important to ask who exactly is being imagined as a human. I'm not immune from this slippage, of course. I sometimes bring my son Lamar to Leslie Spit, a beach-ish in Toronto. I don't know if you've been there. I visit semi-frequently because it's not too far and I'm afraid of driving, and I like to spend as much time outdoors as I can. While he and I meander near the water collecting treasure, rocks, for him to bring home, I often muse that perhaps this is what the city would look like after humans, that this is how the earth might begin to recover itself. The brown-gray sand is lined with rebar, large chunks of concrete. I have let Lamar go barefoot here, but warily, me carefully scrutinizing the ground beneath his feet, as his lean brown legs propel him freely in and out of the shallow water. The beach pebbles are mixed in with ground up bricks and chunks of glass, most but not all of their hard edges softened over time. Broken tiles mixed throughout the sand and rocks have reemerged to look almost but not quite like the stones they were forged from. It's beautiful somehow, despite being somewhat post-apocalyptic, like the ghosts of an abandoned city that the environment is slowly taking back. It has a hopeful feel to me. Like if we ruin this earth through greed and gross irresponsibility, it would find a way to recover itself without people in the way. As I point this out to my son, trying to use language that makes sense for a 4-year-old, I always need to catch myself. I do not want to teach us the wrong lesson. It's an easy slippage and one with deadly implications because we, people, did not do this, I tell him, correcting myself, as I tell him about how the earth is sick and we have to make sure we do what we can to fix it. It's not humanity that poisons so much earthly, human and non-human life, but a small and highly powerful minority of humanity and the order they have imposed on earthly life. The climate catastrophe was born not from mankind, but from the slave plantation, the settler town, the prison, the reservation. For this reason, it's unsurprising that the solutions being forwarded by those in power are more of the same. The border wall, the immigration detention center, the refugee camp, the open pit mine. And these are supposed to seem just as natural of a response. For us to live in anything that I hope we could one day call freedom, it is necessary to put a swift end to the death drive disguised as a worldview, the murderous episteme that is being imposed on us by the master settler CEO. All world endings are not tragic. There are some world endings that I am comfortable with. I like to think about late capitalism as a kind of aspirational descriptor, more than as a strictly Marxist category. In order to make earthly planetary survival, some versions of this world need to end, and indeed should never have begun in the first instance. Some worlds, after all, depended on the ongoing, violent, always racial and gender differentiated foreclosures of other worlds. While I'm devastated and terrified by the IPCC predictions for living things on this earth to avoid the worst case scenarios now predicted by global scientific consensus, it's necessary for us to have the courage to envision the end of this world, that is, the world that white supremacy built, to move toward liberatory futures that are premised on life rather than human, ecological, animal, microbial waste. This disruption is what Fanon was getting at when he wrote in Wretched of the Earth, that decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. Disorder is not the same as chaos. It implies instead a radical rupture from the dominant order, which is after all murderous. A program of disorder implies here that we radically alter and indeed breach entirely with the current order of things and the global violences upon which disorder relies. I believe that world ending and world making can occur, are occurring, have always occurred simultaneously. Given that racial and ecological violence are interwoven and inextricable from one another, now more than ever, Black and Indigenous communities who are globally positioned as first to die within the climate crisis are also on the front lines of world-making practices that threaten to overthrow the current death-making global episteme. Perhaps our communities, quite literally the post-apocalyptic survivors of world endings already, are best positioned to imagine what this might be. This, after all, is the radical promise, if as of yet unachieved, that was and is extended to us by the world-making projects of abolition and decolonization. More on this between us soon. If our histories are intimately intertwined with one another's, so too are our futures. Leanne, your work has helped me enormously in thinking through how to collectively survive and co-resist in the ongoing apocalypse. And I think that understanding the contemporary crisis as the longue durée of slavery, colonialism, and ongoing settler colonialism also has the ability to shape and reshape our world making and our interlocking justice struggles in the face of the climate crisis. So this is what I'm wondering with you. How do our respective political traditions inform old, new ontologies that are by necessity outside of the barricades, beyond and against the death drive of white supremacy, racial capitalism, the carceral life-ending captivity of police and policing, and constant and unceasing extraction? What kind of world making, what kind of livingness do we see emerging as always already in the works from the past, present, Black and Indigenous traditions of radicalism, anti-colonial resistance, and co-resistance? These are some of the questions I'm thinking of with and alongside you at the end of the world. If you feel inclined to write me back, please feel free to answer them or ignore them entirely. The future feels daunting. Maybe writing together, walking together, witnessing these times together in this way will help us to forge ahead differently. At the very least, it might help us to limit our doom scrolling. And maybe it will help us to anchor ourselves and one another as we try to find a way to map out liberated futures for our children and theirs in a time when any notion of future feels unnavigable. I'm hoping mostly in writing you that maybe this grounding together will help remind us that anyways, we and ours have been building livable worlds to live in all along, despite and against forces aligned to steal our light. And we will continue to do so no matter what comes our way.
Minnow Nakshik, when Robyn Maynard writes you a letter, you write back. Robyn, the first thing I underlined in my now worn out copy of your book, Policing Black Lives, was the very first line of the acknowledgement section. Quote, writing Policing Black Lives was a community affair. Born out of movement work, it is geared towards nourishing those same movements that have given me life over the last years, end quote. I knew after reading that first line that this book was going to be distinct. Policing Black Lives was written for different reasons than most books published in Canada, reasons that I had profound respect for. Knowledge, research, analysis, and writing born out of movement work and geared towards nourishing, sustaining, and propelling movements for Black life. Robust intellectual work in the service of radical Black futurities. Policing Black Lives holds up community and shines a light on the generations of freedom fighters who individual and collective sacrifices have brought us to this moment. As I read on, I underlined your careful and gentle insistence that Black and Indigenous struggles, while distinct, were also linked. This was significant to me because it gestures towards a more rigorous and nuanced relationality between Black and Indigenous communities, reminiscent of radical Black feminist traditions embodied in so many writers. Writers like Makeda Silvera, Nerbasi Philip, Dion Brandt, and Afea Cooper. In Policing Black Lives, you were the first one to gather together the work of Black feminists and organizers and provide us with a volcano of meticulously researched evidence that destroyed Canadian innocence and exceptionalism with regards to transatlantic slavery and anti-Blackness. In Policing Black Lives, you taught me abolition on stolen land is the practice of caring. My book, As We Have Always Done, came out the same year as yours. I remember wishing your book had come out first because it would have made As We Have Always Done more complete and rigorous. I would have brought Policing Black Lives into conversation with the chapters in As We Have Always Done, and from an Indigenous perspective, pointed towards the same robust and nuanced relationality between Indigenous and Black communities you had done in Policing Black Lives, albeit from my own Anishinaabe perspective. So when an occasion presented itself to launch As We Have Always Done in Georgiaga in Ganagihaga territory, or Montreal, where you were living at the time, I wanted to invite you into a conversation and a thinking through between ourselves and our books. You, Robyn, graciously accepted that invitation, and our conversation took place on April 14th, 2018. The event was moderated by curator, art historian, writer, and academic Lindsay Nixon, who brought a series of guiding questions to orient our dialogue. This was the very first time we had met in person. I remember the Black community of Montreal showing up in power at the event. I remember being very nervous, as one should be when they first encounter with someone who's on stage with a mic in front of a beautiful, articulate, intelligent audience. I remember your pink lipstick. I remember my Blistex. I remember being painfully aware that I was dressed like I was from Ontario. I can't remember very much about what we talked about, but we obviously had the sense to record it because there is an edited transcript of part of our conversation in Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada. This was our first visit. Roughly a year later, in 2019, as part of my work at the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning in Benande, I helped conceptualize, organize, and actualize a solidarity gathering that took place in March in the territory of the Yellow Knives Dene First Nation with my colleagues Glenn Coulthard and Kelsey Wrightson. Our idea was simple: to invite a small group of Black, Brown, and Indigenous activists, artists, thinkers, writers, and organizers to spend time with us in the spring on an island in what the Yellowknives Dene know as Dinde, or Big Lake. Together, we fished nets under the ice, traveled by snowmobile and sleigh across the lake, shared moose ribs cooked over the fire, stories from the elders, our own ideas, and time with each other. We wanted to invest in our relationship with each other and our affinities outside of the institution, the internet, crises. And because we believed that the land would pull out a different set of conversations and gift us with a different way of relating. We wanted to sit together on the land, immersed in a Dene world, engaged in a practice of Dene hospitality to see if we related to each other in a different way. This is exactly what happened. The land nurtured a set of conversations and a way of relating to each other outside of institutions and their formations. I remember you and I eating muskox around the fire, talking about how different eating muskox around a fire in the bush was from meeting in a hallway or a bar at a conference, or even interacting online. We were also meeting and there was no crisis or blockade or protest or agenda. We were coming together to nourish each other, to relate to each other, to listen and share, and to breathe together, to use Narbesi Phillips thinking. I could intellectualize about the experience and speak in terms of relationality and relationship building, something I think Black and Indigenous activists in the 1960s and 1970s understood far better than us. I could talk about this from an Indigenous methodological angle, with visiting and developing relationships of trust as foundational to any exchange of knowledge and experience. I could write about the spiritual dimension of this work from, again, Indigenous perspectives, being surrounded by trees, medicine, air, sky, and water. In a sense, though, none of that particularly matters, other than to say, I think land-based politics, grounded in a sustained and nurturing relationship with the natural world and protecting nature as a means of protecting ourselves, can be one generative means of nourishing Black and Indigenous politics of solidarity. Our starting point was simple: that land and placemaking, although perhaps different, were and remain important to both Black and Indigenous peoples. Our starting point was a refusal of the nation state and the racial capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy embodied in those structures. Our starting point was a recognition that transatlantic slavery, and as Sadea Hartman says, its afterlives, and colonialism mean we have distinctive and intertwined histories, presence, and distinctive and intertwined theory and world-building practices. We imagined the synergistic potential of Black land politics and Indigenous land politics towards liberated lands and bodies. In the aftermath of that gathering, the possibilities to continue this work seemed endless. Trips to the sugar bush in Anishinaabe territory, hikes in downtown Toronto, exchanges between our freedom schools, gatherings in the Caribbean, and then the pandemic hit. We were faced with another crisis on top of the crises of anti-Blackness, colonialism, and climate change. Our lives shrunk into our home spaces during stay-at-home orders. There was an urgency in addressing the pandemic under white supremacy because we knew that Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples are always the first to die, and that any state solutions will be made to first save white people's lives and livelihoods. Zoom seemed like the very last place we wanted to continue this work. In fact, to me, it felt like virtual environments were I can't pronounce that word, antithetical to this work. And so you and I decided to write each other letters because we couldn't see each other in person. As an honored radical Black feminist methodology of scaffolding the intimate and personal within the global, letter writing made sense. we decided to not only write what we know, but to attempt to think through things together, to generate through this intentional relationship a sort of study of Black and Indigenous relationality through the study of our own responsive relationality. In hindsight, and after reading Catherine McKittrick's Dear Science, each of us drew on our distinct rebellious methodologies in this project. For you, Black theory, story, knowledge, and methodologies of knowledge production. For me, Anishinaabe story as theory, knowledge, and methodologies of knowledge production. The intersection was friendship, collaboration, song, story, movement work, citations, analytics, and oral practice. These interstitial spaces are this project. We made a commitment to each other to think alongside each other through the chaos of the global COVID-19 pandemic, through the ongoing pandemic of Black and Indigenous death and erasure, and through the beautiful revolutions of Black and Indigenous organizing and resistance. We agreed to be first and foremost empathetic, responsible, and gentle with each other, which required a trust and a vulnerability that for me was new in intellectual work. We didn't shy away from the issues and tensions between our two communities. What began as a series of letters with footnotes between us has grown into something that has expanded outside the two of us, and then grown again into this book project, Rehearsals for Living. The book is a chronicle of our thinking in a particular moment in time. It's messy, it's incomplete, it's gentle. It's in its simplest form, a record of our relationality. The recording of this record required a divestment of the arrogance of the expert in favor of openness, intimacy, care, and humility. And so these letters are also songs that chronicle our love and our friendship. And like making a record, listening became perhaps the most important methodology. Robyn, you are a fully formed thinker, writer, and researcher, not because of the credentials of the academy, but because of your practice, your ethics, and your bodies of work. You're steeped in an extensive network of movement and organizing experience in Black systems of knowledge production, analysis, and theory making, in addition to the written work of Black and anti-colonial scholars. Robyn, I've learned so very much from you and those formations of young Black activists on our streets, bringing forth new worlds before our very eyes. There are many Indigenous and Black peoples that have done and are doing the same kind of thinking in the academy and outside on the streets, in encampments, in prisons, around kitchen tables, and in the bush. We are centering Indigenous and Black lives because we are Anishinaabe and Black, not because we don't value our relationships in solidarity with anti-colonial racialized people in Canada and beyond. Waweni, we will go carefully. Now, in the book, I go on to write about the beginning of the pandemic, the time a year ago when we were under the first stay-at-home order, where we didn't know the phrases second wave or third wave or fourth wave, and we were barely wearing masks, and where Black activists and organizers were building support systems, protests, and communities of care for their people. I was thinking through with Robyn how my understanding of the pandemic at that time will potentially impact folks already dealing with the pandemics of anti-Blackness, colonialism, and climate change. Here we are a year later. In Ontario, our healthcare system is on the verge of collapse. We're facing the worst crisis of the pandemic, and where the provincial government continues, as you, Robyn, and Andrea Ritchie wrote a year ago on Vice, to, quote, sacrifice Black lives in the service of white public health through disproportionate exposure or policing the people with the least ability to stay home. Here we are a year later, and Doug Ford is still refusing science and exponents, still refusing paid sick leave, still refusing vaccinations and support for Black essential workers and their families, and instead increasing policing, instead deliberately choosing a preventable situation where sickness and death is falling upon Black and racialized workers. Instead, as you and Richie wrote, the provincial government is, quote, recreating a long-standing historical injustice that dates back to slavery, the expectation that Black women care for others while being denied the ability to care for themselves and one another. In the service of time, I'm going to leave that section out and move to the end of my first letter to you, Robyn, where I think about Indigenous life and pandemics through the historical experience of my ancestors and my family. The first story has sexualized violence in it, and if that's too much for anyone to take on right now, then take a break from the Zoom and come back in 5 minutes. Prior to the pandemic, I imagined you, Robyn, and I taking our kids and physically walking the route that you had found on Google Maps. I imagined the kids laughing and running ahead of us. I imagined complaining about how far we were going. I imagined lots of questions about when we were going to get there. I thought we would take the route from your home to places on Bay Street in Toronto, where our collective genocides are always being mapped out. I thought it would be interesting to walk the land and to walk to the city together with our Indigenous and Black loves from different generations. I was interested to see how our kids would find joy anyway, because that is always the gift of young people. I was interested to see how we would find joy anyway. I was interested in how we would each uncover signals from and of our communities and separate these signals from the noise of the city. I was interested to see the Black and Indigenous worlds we would create together along the route. I was interested in developing this as a practice over time, perhaps taking different groups of people with us, collectively coding, decoding, and recoding the city. What would happen if we took the land-based practice of walking the land, walking a part of our intertwined worlds together? What would be our experience? What would we learn? How would we deepen our relationship to each other and to this place? Now, given the pandemic, we don't know when we'll be able to walk anywhere together. Underneath the visible Toronto, or maybe not underneath, maybe beside, is an Indigenous Toronto. A Michisagi, Kinishnaabeg, Ichianjakewin, a Haudenosaunee, Karanto, a Wendat place, one that exists today, one that used to exist in relation to the buried and forgotten creeks, the islands that didn't used to be an island, and the rivers, the Rouge River, the Humber, the Don, and the Credit River. When our kids weren't paying attention because we had loaded them up with ice cream and we were standing where the St. Lawrence Market is today, I'd ask first because there's sexual violence in this story, and then I'd whisper. On August 20th, 1796, a small group of Michisagi came to York, now Toronto, from the Credit River to sell salmon in the area in what is now known as the St. Lawrence Market. Wabakanini, his partner, and his sister, whose names are not in the historical record, camped for the night on the waterfront across from Barry's Tavern, just east of the market block. The remainder of their group camped on the peninsula, which eventually evolved into the Toronto Islands. Just before midnight, a Queen's Ranger named Charles McEwen approached Wabakanini's family. At some point in that evening, McEwen had given Wabakanini's sister $1 and some rum to, quote, induce her to grant him certain favors. McEwen arrived with 2 compatriots to rape Oda Weeman, Wabakanini's sister. Wijiwagan, Wabakanini's partner, awoke to see McEwen dragging Oda Weeman from the canoe she had been sleeping under. Of course, she woke Wabakanini for help. Wabakanini confronted those 3 white men, and McEwen murdered him and then physically assaulted Wijiwagan. Their Anishinaabe relations camped on the peninsula heard the terror and rushed to Wabakanini, Oda Weeman, and Wijiwagan. The white men who had viciously attacked the Michisagi Anishinaabe had left. The Anishinaabe collected their loved ones and carried them to the peninsula. The next day, they took them home to the Credit River. Wabakanini died of his injuries on the way. Wijiwagan died of her injuries shortly after. They were buried soon after. When this story spread across Kinagachi and Anishinaabeg Ogaming, Michisagi and Anishinaabeg were outraged and demanded accountability and justice, and they mobilized. McEwen faced a grand jury in mid-December for the murder of Wabakinini, but was promptly discharged as a result of, quote, it not having been proven that the chief with whose murder he was charged is dead. No white authorities had seen Wabakinini's body, which the Mississaugas had buried soon after his death. The Michisagi Anishinaabe refused to appear in court to give evidence, I presume because they had zero faith in colonial judicial processes to bring about justice, accountability, or a rebalancing of relations, or perhaps because policing and justice systems were not part of the world they had built and the ways that they took care of each other. Despite having conversations with their allies, including Six Nations, the Michisagi Anishinaabe were unable to launch a military attack on Fort York. They were ultimately too overwhelmed with death from infectious disease, dispossession, and the colonial-induced collapse of their economic, social, and political systems. This story is eerie. It's methodic, deliberate, and rhythmic repetition of violence from Fort York in 1796 to Toronto in 2021 is infuriating. As you know, a different but related set of events took place 62 years before these murders. The horrific torture and murder of an enslaved Black woman in 1734, Marie Joseph Angelique in Jojaga or Montreal, as told to us by Afia Cooper in her meticulous work, The Hanging of Angelique. Angelique was arrested, tortured, and publicly hanged for attempting to flee from her white mistress, and she was accused of burning down old Montreal. Both you in Policing Black Lives and Cooper compel us to remember or to learn that this story is one of resistance and revolt. We have been together in this place for a long, long time. As I write this, I'm thinking of the murders and the resistance of Marie Joseph Angelique and Luigi Waganen and their families and communities in Toronto and Montreal. Of course, we know the logics that led to the death of these women were different. The stories are not the same or equivalent. What is overwhelming to me in bringing these stories into conversation is that these same narratives have been repeated over and over and over in the years since 1763 and 1796. And there are now thousands upon thousands of Black people and Indigenous people who have experienced eliminatory, sexualized, and gender violence, particularly trans and queer people. I want to build a world alongside yours where, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, all life is precious. After our walk, I wanted to invite you and your child to Peterborough, which is my home. I would have told you the story that made me. Instead, I'll write you a version of that story, a version that speaks to epidemics and loss, hope and resistance, family and land, and the love that bind us together. In the 1930s, my grandmother Audrey was a 10-year-old Anishinaabe Kwai living on Wolfe Street in Peterborough, Ontario, having recently moved to town from the reserve, but still spending glorious summers on Rice Lake in her home community of Alderville First Nation. Her father and my great-grandfather, Hartley Franklin, most often a fishing guide on Rice Lake, had found more stable employment building canoes for the Peterborough Canoe Company, necessary in part because of the loss of hunting and fishing rights in the wake of the fraudulent Williams Treaties of 1923. The life he created itself was a feat, an intact Michisagi Anishinaabe family with children in the home, living in our homeland with food and shelter, but the calm would not last. A decade before the discovery of antibiotics, Hartley contracted tuberculosis and was quarantined in a sanatorium more than 200 kilometers away in Kitchener, Ontario. Audrey, her mother and little brother, moved to Galt to be closer to him. When Audrey's mama, Agnes, also got tuberculosis, my grandmother and her brother were apprehended into foster care with white families. Hartley eventually died in the sanatorium when my grandmother was 14. She remembers standing by his casket in Grandma Ida Smoke's living room on the reserve in Alderville while her mom was fighting for her own life in the sanatorium. 2 years later, Angus recovered, but my grandma was forced to quit school when their living allowance was cut off. She got a job at Galtwood Heel, gluing heels onto shoes for 10 hours a day. In the span of a decade, my family went from living on the reserved, immersed in Anishinaabe life and community, to being alone with grief in a city several hundred kilometers away. Tuberculosis succeeded in removing my family from our territory, away from our land, family, culture, and language, and pushed us further into the wage economy, meeting Canada's political goals of eliminating Indigenous people through either death or assimilation. I live a few blocks away from the house my grandmother lived in as a child in Peterborough. Every night at 8 o'clock, my daughter Min and I run through our neighborhood. The streets are quiet. Min likes the color of the sky at civil twilight. She practices her vertical leap by attempting to high-five a giant white pine. I think about how each week she gets faster and faster while I stay exactly the same. By the time we're back at our house, away from the motion detecting lights of our neighbors, we can see the first stars. She points them out and names them while I just listen, which I now realize is always the most important job. A strong part of me wants to use these half-hour runs to lecture my captive audience of one. I want Min to carry within her body a sharp knife. I want to assign her Robyn Maynard, Andrea Ritchie, and Elle Jones's recent writings on COVID-19 in the dominating structure of anti-Blackness, and then discuss them on the nightly run. I want to talk to her about communities like Grassy Narrows and how they will face COVID-19 with all the same challenges as other remote First Nations: food insecurity, lack of adequate housing and healthcare, and the endless fumbling bureaucracy of Indigenous service agencies in places where community members already have compromised health from mercury poisoning in the 1970s, TB exposure in residential schools, and a host of other chronic colonial-induced diseases. I want her to know the situation for urban Indigenous peoples is challenging in a different way under COVID-19. Our families too experience high rates of housing and food insecurity, but also police surveillance and violence, incarceration, intimate violence, substance use, and street affected realities. And for our gender non-conforming, non-binary, and trans relations, navigating a mostly hostile medical system committed to the gender binary and transphobia. I want her to know that Prairie First Nations and Métis people, the death-making machine of white racism, has already intensified during the pandemic. On the first day of April last year, Calgary police charged a man for uttering death threats when he said he would intentionally spread COVID-19 to Indigenous peoples. On April 2nd, RCMP arrested a suspect in the murder of two Métis men, Jake Sampson and Morris Cardinal, who were out hunting to feed their family. And on April 9th, 16-year-old Aisha Hudson was shot and killed by Winnipeg police. I want her to know that the oil and gas industry has continued to endanger Indigenous people in Wet'suwet'en homelands by continuing work along the pipeline route and housing hundreds of workers in man camps. I want her to know that we and everyone we love are more vulnerable because of colonialism, and in crisis, vulnerabilities are amplified. I want her to know that we are not in this together. The empty streets of our neighborhood under social distancing and stay-at-home orders remind me of the loneliness Hartley Franklin must have felt, quarantined in an institution for years, far from everything Anishinaabe and all of his loves. I wonder if he would feel the same relief I do watching Min harvesting wild rice, or splitting spruce roots for a canoe, or standing in traffic in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, or running with the stars through the neighborhood where he brought his family in the precious moments before Anishinaabe life was stolen. I wonder if he could still find meaning in twilight or stars, or in the frozen lake of grief that inevitably blanketed him. Minaway is living through a pandemic at the same age my grandmother was when she lost her dad to the epidemic of TB. Minaway is teaching me not to crush her joy. On our nightly runs, she demands I stay in the moment, breathe in sharp air, and listen for the drumming of our shoes on the cement against the rhythm of our breathing. She reminds me to look forward to the crew at the end of the street that meticulously chalks Scooby-Doo characters onto their sidewalk each day, to not aimlessly veer into traffic when I see another human on the sidewalk, and to maybe even practice my vertical jump too. Each night, Min pulls me out of myself and insists that I remember that running through the inky bruises, seeking light from the moon and beside someone you love is one of the best parts of life. She reminds me that maybe if you are a 14-year-old Anishinaabe and you can find the will to reach up to our tree of peace, you don't always need the lecture and the sharp knife. Maybe you've already beaten COVID-19 and are in the midst of dreaming beyond colonialism. Miigwech.
It is unfortunately bringing us to the end of our time for this evening. I want to say such a warm thank you to Robyn and Leanne for that generous and inspiring exchange. It feels like a great privilege to be invited into your project and to hear you think and dream together, to hear about your interlocking work exploring Black and Anishinaabe resistance and resurgence in light of climate collapse, white supremacy, pandemic, and late capitalism. And it's all the more remarkable that while addressing these challenging topics with eyes wide open, your voices are so gentle, joyful, and nourishing. Thank you. I want to remind our attendees that these letters and others will appear in your forthcoming book, Rehearsals for Living, to be published in 2022. And I'm sure you found some new readers tonight. Thanks again to our generous sponsor, the Thakore Learning and Events Endowment, and to our event partner, SFU Public Square. I'd particularly like to thank Chloe Riley and Tony Liu from the library for their work in planning and promoting this event. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.